Thanks very much, Basha. It really is an honor on my part to be here, to have been invited by Seth and the team. This is the first time I've had a chance to be a part of the plenary, at least in this capacity. And I want to solidarize with a number of things that Keeanga said, which I won't repeat. Indeed, this is a historic moment that we're living through, unprecedented. And it is indeed an important time for us, progressive forces, to come together to think about how to go forward. The crisis of capitalism continues to deepen. Some of us think it begins in the mid-1970s with the 74-75 recession, then the next dip in 81, 82. And you could see the crisis in the forms it took. Anybody who was here in New York City may remember there was a very important lesson, too, in the middle of that crisis. And that's when representative democracy was suspended for about 3 years. The Emergency Finance Control Board, that is. Government was taken out of the hands of the electorate in an Emergency Finance Control Board. In other words, what you see in Flint, Michigan, what you see in many cities in Michigan is not unique. New York, in many ways, was in the vanguard of that process. And it reflects what we will see more and more, the fundamental incompatibility between capitalism and democracy. That's what's reflected. And so, yes, this crisis had a major impact on the working class. For some of us, we think this was the beginning of the end of the American dream. We couldn't see how long it would take. And one of the things that some of us didn't anticipate is how the ruling class would make use of credit and debt in order to camouflage the depths of the crisis. And so many people thought they could use their houses as ATM machines. And all of that came to an end, though, in the bubble crisis in 2008. As Keeanga said, the crisis within one segment of the working class, within the African-American community, is especially grave. And the only figure I would add to her very helpful data that she presented is to look at household wealth, racial household wealth. And the latest figures from the Federal Reserve Board indicate that for every $1 of white household wealth, African-Americans have the equivalent of 6 cents. It may have gone up to 7 cents. But it speaks volumes. It speaks volumes about the reality of the African Americans. And Latinos are in a similar situation. Both groups, because of the housing crisis, were particularly affected. And if African Americans didn't achieve racial equality during the boom times of capitalism, does anyone expect that will be possible in this kind of economy where increasingly bourgeois economists are talking about the phenomenon of secular stagnation, where you have low growth rates, productivity rates at a historical low. If it didn't happen, if racial equality didn't happen during the boom time, there's no prospect for it, given the reality of capitalism today. And that makes it all the more important to recognize that the only way in which racial equality can be achieved is when the working class takes political power. The working class has to take political power and begin charting a course toward a socialist revolution. In 1893, Frederick Engels responded to a comrade here in Hoboken, across the river, complaining about the fact, one of the leaders of the Marxist movement, complaining about the fact that he was frustrated with the fact that we couldn't get off the ground a real working class political party. The United States was the only major advanced capitalist country where that wasn't happening. And that still is the case today. We don't have a mass working class political party. And at that particular time in Europe, this was getting off the ground. All of the labor parties were getting off the ground at that particular moment, but it wasn't happening in the United States. And the Marxist current understood the working class could only come to power if it had its own political party. It had to be independent of the two bourgeois parties. So he was frustrated. So he asked Engels for some advice on why this was happening. And Engels responded to say, I think there are three basic reasons for this. One is an institutional problem, the difficulty of getting a third party off the ground. And he referred to the winner-take-all, first-past-the-post electoral system. In other words, the absence of proportional representation made it difficult to get a third party off the ground. That was one factor. The second factor was the divisions within the working class. The divisions within the working class. And there were two important divisions, the native-born versus the non-native. And the immigrants, in other words, versus the natives, and how the bosses pitted these two groups against one another. That division made it very difficult for the working class of the United States to come together, to see itself as a class. And the other major division, of course, was the race question, especially the black-white conflict, or as Marx and Engels put it, I think more correctly, workers in white skin and workers in black skin, and how bosses pitted those two groups against one another. And Engels understood the history of the United States. This is how the ruling class stayed in power from the very beginning. Never ever forget that the system of racial slavery came out of the system of indentured servitude, a fundamentally, essentially class institution. And the purpose of racial slavery was to pit indentured servants against one another, the divide and rule strategy. That's how the Jim Crow system came into existence after the Civil War, for that brief moment during the Reconstruction, where workers in white skin and black skin were beginning to come together. The Jim Crow system, the purpose of the Jim Crow system was, again, to pit workers against one another, the divide and rule strategy. And so Engels understood that until this was solved, there would be no possibility of the working class being able to forge a labor party and being able to take political power. Marx said on at least 3 or 4 occasions, labor in white skin will never be able to emancipate itself until labor in black skin is free of discrimination. Labor in white skin will never be able to emancipate itself until labor in black skin is free of discrimination. This is their perspective, and they understood, therefore, the reality and the limits, and the task, therefore, was how to forge that. An important moment in the history of the working class is what was achieved in the Freedom Now movement. I don't call it the Civil Rights Movement. The movement called itself the Freedom Now movement. It didn't call itself the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights said limits what the movement was about. Never forget what the slogan was of the famous March on Washington in 1963, for jobs and freedom. That's what the march was about. And so this slogan, civil rights, is a way of limiting what was the actual aspirations of the movement itself. But I think coming out of that second Reconstruction, as we sometimes call it, I think we find a working class that has less divisions in it than was the case going into the second Reconstruction. I'm old enough to remember, I grew up under the Jim Crow system. I grew up under that system where both my parents, who were very active in the trade union movement, both presidents of their unions, but they were all black unions. The trade union movement was segregated. And think about the limits on that and trying to carry out joint actions on the impossibility of trying to do that. When I look at Black Lives Matter today and the protests and so on, I'm struck by the multiracial character of it. Go back and look at the images of the protests, the urban rebellions, the so-called race riots of the 1960s and so on, which almost always began with allegations of police brutality. They were almost exclusively African American, almost exclusively. That's different today. And that's different today, I think, because of the gains of the second Reconstruction in the Freedom Now movement. What we able to do? We have less obstacles in being able to come together, and we bring all kinds of issues beyond just the race question, the gender question, sexual orientation. All of that now is put on the agenda, which in the 1960s simply was not the case. So I think we have to be aware of and see, in fact, that there were gains that were made in terms of our ability to come together to function collectively in a way that just wasn't the case before the second Reconstruction. There was a third factor that Engels said that was a limiting factor on class and class consciousness in the United States. And basically, he was referring to the American dream. To the extent that workers had come from abroad, in other countries and so on, and grab a piece of land, they may have gone, you can go west. You may begin as a worker on the East Coast, but you can go west and become a property owner. And to the extent that that was open, that placed limits on a hereditary working class in the United States. There was a joke in the Marxist movement always that people who were radicals in Europe, they would leave Europe as radicals, come to the United States, and get lost on the prairie. Never know whatever happened to them, because they had bought it, become a part of the system. And Engels understood, as long as that possibility was open, as long as that possibility to become a property owner was open and so on, that limited class consciousness. This is why the 2008 housing bubble is so significant. The disappearance of the American dream. And I say this is important to think about because it has implications, I think, in how we look at Trump supporters. If there's one thing the Trump phenomenon has revealed is the end of the American dream for large layers of Caucasian workers. Large layers. Last summer, I had a chance to be in the middle of Appalachia and had fascinating discussions and so on with unemployed, laid-off coal workers and so on. And I remember walking through one of the hollows. That's when I finally figured out what a hollow is in West Virginia and so on. And I got there on the first day, and there were about 5 Confederate flags in the hollow. I just come. This is about a month after the horrors in Charleston. By the time I left 10 days later, almost all of those flags came down. And I was able to walk and have discussions about what was happening, how people were being devastated and so on. We learned about the illness problem, all the health issues and so on, within that part of the country. And I found an opening to talking with these workers. And I was able to, I found an opening on the part of those workers, unemployed workers. We were able to get past this very quickly. Skin color, and be able to deal with the real political issues and so on. I say that because it would be an error on our part, I think, to dismiss them, to dismiss those supporters. We need to talk to them, have discussions with them, be able to debate with them and so on. Remember, I think it was Marx once said, a drowning person will grab onto a twig if they think that's going to save them. A drowning person will grab onto a twig if they think that's going to save them. And this is what's happening to large layers of the Caucasian working class staff who are losing the American dream. So I want to raise that, and finally, we can have a discussion more about it. Let me just end with the other major thing I wanted to address, that is the electoral process. In 2014, I wrote that progressive forces should have no illusions that a Syriza government in Greece will advance the interests of the working class. I wrote that in 2014, and I'm sad to say, I think I was correct. And I made that assessment based upon an analysis of Marx and Engels and Lenin's approach to the electoral process. Marx, Engels, and Lenin argued that there is no parliamentary road to socialism. There's no parliamentary road to socialism. The Paris Commune had taught, the only time they ever made a revision to the Communist Manifesto, the Paris Commune had taught that the working class cannot seize the bourgeois state and use the bourgeois state to carry out tasks for the working class. The bourgeois state has to be replaced. The bourgeois state has to be replaced. And elections and parliamentary work are only a means to an end, not an end in itself. Only a means to an end. We use elections in the parliamentary system to get out revolutionary ideas, to talk to people, to build revolutionary movements. And the second task, Marx and Engels said and Lenin said, with the electoral process, we use that opportunity to count our forces. We use that opportunity to count our forces. And while Marx and Engels could not always be as explicit because of censorship and what they meant by it, Lenin could be very clear about it. we count our forces to determine the date when to seize power. We use the electoral system to count who's on our side, who's willing to vote with their feet. That's the important. It's a means to an end. And we only have one example I know in history, where the working class has ever used the electoral parliamentary arena to seize political power, and that's what the Bolsheviks did in 1917. If you look at what's happening in the world, I'll end here, what's happening today. Think about the tragedy that's unfolding in Brazil at this moment. People who thought that they could make use of the parliamentary road for building socialism. The thing is falling apart, sadly. I was in Brazil in 2003 when the Workers' Party came to power, and I remember trying to warn people at that time to be sober about this, to be sober. All kinds of movements in Latin America thought they could do it differently from the Cubans. No, we're going to do it differently. Sandinistas tried to do it differently. Allende in Chile thought it could be done differently. The Workers' Party in Brazil thought it can be done differently. And sadly, and even socialism for the 21st century, what's happening tragically as we speak about in Venezuela at this particular moment. These are the lessons that we have to absorb and be honest about. Look what's going on in France at this moment. We already knew the Socialist Party betrayed the working class, but it's always amazing how low they can stoop each new moment in stabbing the working class in the back in France. So in involving ourselves, therefore, in electoral parliamentary systems and so on, process and work and so on, be under no illusion that it's through elections, it's through the parliamentary road and operations and practices and so on, that the working class will only take power. It's only when we vote, power has to be taken. Think about elections. When you go into the booth and so on, you're not taking power, you're registering a preference. It takes only, 5 to 20 seconds and so on. It's all done very individually, usually in secret and so on. No three things that could be further from the reality of what it means to actually take power. We should never confuse voting with the actual process of taking power. Power has to be taken. And this is what Marx, Engels, and Lenin understood, and I think that's the lesson for us.